Before we begin today's episode, we want to acknowledge that today's conversation involves competitive sports, identity, and evolving policies around fairness and inclusion. These topics can be complex, and they often bring strong opinions from many different perspectives. Our goal in this discussion is not to dismiss anyone's identity or personal experience, but to examine how governing bodies make decisions about competition, particularly how fairness, safety, and opportunity are balanced in women's sports. We'll be talking about biology, policy, and the structure of athletic competition, all of which play a role in how categories are defined. These are not simple questions, and there are thoughtful arguments on multiple sides. As always, we encourage listeners to approach the conversation with respect, critical thinking, and a willingness to hear different viewpoints. This discussion is about understanding the issue, not reducing it to slogans.
Every sport in the world starts with the same basic idea: fairness. Not equal outcomes, not guaranteed wins, but a level playing field where competition actually means something. That's why we have weight classes in boxing. That's why we separate age groups in youth sports. And that's why men's and women's sports exist in the first place, because biological differences in strength, speed, and endurance matter when it comes to competition. But right now, that foundation is being questioned. Over the past few years, we've watched governing bodies, leagues, and international organizations struggle to define where the line is, how to balance inclusion with fairness, identity with biology, and individual rights with competitive integrity. And this week, the conversation hit a global level again. The International Olympic Committee, one of the most influential organizations in sports, has taken a position that's reigniting debate around who competes in women's sports and under what rules. But here's where things get complicated, because depending on who you listen to, you're hearing completely different narratives. One side says this is about fairness, protecting women's sports and ensuring that female athletes aren't competing at a disadvantage. Another side says this is about exclusion, that athletes are being pushed out based on identity. And then there's the media framing, which often simplifies the issue into headlines that don't capture the actual policy. You'll hear words like banned or excluded, when the reality is often more nuanced, involving categories, eligibility rules, and how competition is structured. So tonight, we're not doing slogans. We're asking a harder question. Who decides what fairness actually looks like in women's sports? Because this isn't just about one event, one policy, or one organization. This is about the future of competition. It's about how rules are written. And it's about whether a level playing field still means what we think it means. And that's where we're starting tonight. All right, let's bring in the crew, because this conversation is one of those where definitions matter. Fairness, inclusion, competition. And depending on how you define those, you end up in very different places. Brian's here, and I already know where he's going to land. For him, this comes down to protecting the integrity of women's sports. He's going to argue that categories exist for a reason, and if those boundaries aren't clearly defined, you risk undermining the very purpose of having separate divisions in the first place. Rachel's here, and she's going to bring the data, the policy nuance, and the science into this. She'll help break down what governing bodies are actually doing, how decisions are being made, and where the complexity lies beneath the headlines. Daniel will zoom out and look at the institutional side of this, how organizations like the IOC make these decisions, how global standards get set, and what happens when different countries or leagues start interpreting fairness in different ways. And Skylar will push the inclusion argument that sports are evolving along with society, and that policies need to reflect changing understandings of identity while still trying to maintain fairness. And me, I'm focused on the question behind all of it, because this isn't just about one group of athletes. It's about how we define competition itself, who sets the rules, and whether fairness still means what it used to. Let's get into it. All right, let's start by grounding this conversation in something simple: what women's sports were created to do. Because this isn't arbitrary. Women's sports exist because, on average, there are measurable biological differences between men and women that impact athletic performance: strength, speed, endurance, recovery. Those differences don't make one better than the other, but they do affect competition. And without separate categories, women would have far fewer opportunities to compete at the highest levels. That's the foundation. But now we're in a moment where that foundation is being re-examined. Governing bodies like the International Olympic Committee are trying to navigate a very complicated space, balancing inclusion, identity, fairness, and competitive integrity. And in doing that, they're setting policies that don't just affect one sport or one country, they influence global standards. And that's where the confusion starts. Because depending on how this is framed, you hear completely different things. Some headlines say athletes are being banned, others say it's about protecting fairness. And the reality often sits somewhere in between, in the details of how categories are defined and how eligibility is determined. So before we even get into opinions, I think it's important to ask a foundational question. What is fairness in competition supposed to protect? Is it about equal access to participate? Or is it about ensuring that competitors are on a level playing field within a given category? Because how you answer that question shapes everything else. So Rachel, let me start with you. When governing bodies like the IOC approach this issue, what factors are they actually weighing? What goes into determining eligibility rules in women's sports at that level?
I think the most important thing to understand is that governing bodies like the International Olympic Committee are trying to balance multiple competing priorities at the same time. And those priorities don't always align perfectly. At the core, organizations like the IOC are responsible for ensuring fair competition. That includes maintaining categories that allow athletes to compete on a relatively level playing field. In women's sports, those categories were originally established to account for average biological differences that can influence performance outcomes. But over time, additional considerations have entered the conversation, particularly around inclusion and non discrimination. As social understanding of gender identity has evolved, sports organizations have been under increasing pressure to develop policies that are both fair and inclusive. So, what you see in practice are frameworks that try to define eligibility based on measurable criteria, things like hormone levels, transition timelines, or other physiological markers, rather than identity alone. The idea is to create standards that can be applied consistently across athletes. The challenge is that the science itself is still being debated. While certain physiological advantages are well documented, determining exactly how those advantages persist or change under different conditions is complex. And because of that, policies can vary between organizations, sports, and even countries. That's why this issue feels inconsistent to the public. There isn't one universal rule. There are evolving guidelines that attempt to balance fairness with inclusion, and those guidelines are still being refined. So, from a policy standpoint, this isn't a simple yes or no question. It's an ongoing effort to define categories in a way that maintains competitive integrity while responding to broader social expectations.
Rachel, I think that's where a lot of the frustration comes from. The idea that this is still being figured out in real time while the stakes for athletes are very real. And I understand the attempt to balance fairness and inclusion. That's a reasonable goal. But I also think there's a point where the foundation of competition has to stay clear. Because if categories are designed to create a level playing field, then the question becomes, how far can you stretch those categories before that level playing field starts to break down? And that's where I think a lot of people draw a hard line. Brian, let me bring you in here. When you look at this issue, do you think the current approach from organizations like the IOC is striking the right balance? Or do you think the attempt to accommodate multiple priorities is starting to undermine fairness in women's sports?
Artie, I think Rachel laid out the complexity well, but at some point, complexity can't replace clarity. Because when it comes to competition, fairness has to be the priority, not one of several priorities. The priority. That's the whole reason categories exist in the first place. Women's sports weren't created as a social experiment. They were created to ensure that female athletes could compete, win, and succeed on a level playing field. And that only works if the category itself is clearly defined and consistently protected. And I think where a lot of people, myself included, have concerns is when the definition of that category starts shifting based on evolving standards that aren't universally agreed upon. When rules change from one organization to another, or when they're still being figured out, it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty in competition is a problem. because the athletes competing in these events don't have the luxury of treating this like a theory. They're training for years. They're competing for scholarships, for medals, for careers. So when the rules feel fluid, it raises real concerns about whether the playing field is still even. And I want to be clear, I don't think this is about excluding people from sports. Everyone should have the opportunity to compete, but competition only works when the categories themselves make sense. If you start redefining categories in a way that allows for advantages that the category was designed to account for, then you're not preserving fairness, you're diluting it. And once fairness becomes negotiable, the integrity of the sport starts to erode. So from my perspective, the goal should be simple. Protect the category, protect the athletes within it, and make sure the rules are clear enough that everyone understands what competition actually means.
Brian, that word again, clarity. Because without clear rules, competition stops being predictable, and when it stops being predictable, trust starts to erode. And that's not just an athlete issue. That's an institutional issue. Daniel, let's zoom out to the bigger picture here. When organizations like the IOC are making decisions that affect global competition, they're not just setting rules, they're setting precedent. So what happens when different organizations, countries, and leagues start interpreting fairness differently? Does that create a fragmented system? Or is that just part of how global sports evolve?
Artie, what you're pointing to is exactly where this issue becomes bigger than any single sport or policy. It becomes a question of institutional consistency. When a global organization like the IOC sets guidelines, it's not operating in a vacuum. Those guidelines influence international federations, national governing bodies, collegiate systems, and even youth sports structures. In other words, the ripple effect is massive. But here's the challenge. Not all organizations move at the same pace, and not all countries approach these questions with the same priorities. Some governing bodies will prioritize competitive fairness above all else and establish strict eligibility criteria. Others will place a stronger emphasis on inclusion and adapt their policies accordingly. And when those approaches diverge, you don't get a unified system, you get fragmentation. That fragmentation creates a few key problems. First, it introduces inconsistency for athletes. An athlete might be eligible to compete in one league or country, but not in another. That undermines the idea of universal standards in sport. Second, it creates legal and political pressure. Different jurisdictions have different laws around discrimination, identity, and participation. So governing bodies aren't just making sports decisions, they're navigating legal frameworks as well. And third, it affects public trust. When rules appear inconsistent or constantly changing, people begin to question whether decisions are being made based on clear principles or shifting external pressures. So what we're seeing right now is a system trying to adapt in real time without a fully agreed-upon framework. Some organizations are tightening rules, others are loosening them. And until there's broader alignment, that tension is likely to continue. This isn't just a sports issue anymore. It's a governance issue. It's about how institutions define fairness, how they apply it consistently, and whether those definitions can hold across different cultural and legal environments.
Daniel, that's a big point, because once consistency breaks down, the entire structure starts to feel unstable. And I think that's where a lot of the public confusion comes from. People aren't just reacting to one decision. They're reacting to the fact that the rules don't seem universal. But Skylar, I want to bring you in here because this is where the conversation shifts again. Because while some people see this as a fairness issue, others see it as an inclusion issue. And those two priorities don't always line up cleanly. So from your perspective, how should organizations balance inclusion with competitive fairness? Is there a way to do both effectively, or does one inevitably take priority over the other?
I think the tension we're talking about tonight exists because fairness and inclusion are both legitimate values, but they don't always point to the same solution. From an inclusion standpoint, sports have historically expanded over time to allow more people to participate in whether that's women gaining access to competition, adaptive sports for athletes with disabilities, or broader international representation. So there's a natural push to continue making sports accessible and reflective of a diverse society. But competitive fairness is also real. Categories exist for a reason, and athletes train within those structures, expecting a level playing field. So when policies change, it's understandable that people ask whether those structures are still serving their original purpose. I think where the conversation becomes difficult is when it gets framed as one side versus the other, fairness versus inclusion, as if one has to completely win. In reality, organizations are trying to find ways to acknowledge both. That's why you see discussions about eligibility criteria, different divisions, or alternative competitive structures. None of those solutions are perfect, but they're attempts to navigate a complicated space. And I think it's important to recognize that this isn't just a policy debate. It's also a human one. There are real athletes on all sides of this conversation who are trying to compete, to belong, and to be treated fairly. So from my perspective, the goal shouldn't be to ignore fairness, but to continue working toward solutions that respect both the integrity of competition and the dignity of the individuals involved. And that's not something that gets solved in one decision. I think it's an ongoing process.
Listening to all of this, I think one thing becomes clear. This isn't a simple policy question, even though people try to reduce it to one. Because at its core, this is about how we define fairness in a system that was built on clear categories, and what happens when those categories start to be re-examined. Rachel laid out the complexity from a policy standpoint. Brian emphasized the importance of protecting competitive integrity. Daniel showed how this creates ripple effects across institutions and global systems. And Skylar highlighted the challenge of balancing fairness with inclusion in a way that respects real people on all sides. And I think where a lot of people land, whether they agree or disagree, is on this idea that clarity matters. Because competition only works when the rules are understood, when athletes know what they're competing for, who they're competing against, and what defines a level playing field. And right now, those definitions are being tested. Some people see that as necessary evolution. Others see it as a risk to the integrity of women's sports. But regardless of where you land, the question isn't going away. Because this isn't just about one organization or one event. It's about the future of competition. It's about how rules are written, how they're enforced, and whether fairness can be clearly defined in a changing world. And that's the conversation tonight.
All right, before we wrap up, let's take a quick second to thank the community that keeps Data and Dissonance going. If you value conversations like this, you're thoughtful, honest, and willing to tackle difficult topics without reducing them to headlines, one of the best ways to support the show is through the Data and Dissonance merch and coffee line. We've got a full lineup available, including patriotic apparel, Gen X designs, and some of our most popular bumper stickers like Make Orwell Fiction Again, Keep Your Feelings Off My Freedoms, and Triggered Good. It's gear for people who think independently and aren't afraid to show it. And of course, the coffee. Because let's be honest, conversations like this usually happen with a cup in hand. Whether it's the High Lakes Light Roast, Rock Creek Medium, or Bitterroot Dark French Roast, all roasted right here in the USA, there's something for everyone. You can find everything at the merch store and on the website. Every purchase helps support the show and keeps these conversations independent. And we appreciate every single one of you who's part of this community.
If there's one thing tonight's conversation makes clear, it's that this issue isn't going away anytime soon. And it's not going away because it sits at the intersection of two things people care deeply about: fairness and identity. And those aren't small issues. Fairness is the foundation of competition. It's what gives sports meaning in the first place. Without it, winning doesn't mean the same thing, and the structure that athletes rely on starts to lose its clarity. At the same time, identity is deeply personal. It's not something people take lightly, and it's not something that can simply be dismissed without creating real tension. So what we're watching right now is a system trying to reconcile those two realities. And that's not easy, because competition requires clear categories. It requires defined rules. It requires boundaries that everyone understands before they step onto the field. And when those boundaries start to shift, even with good intentions, it raises questions about whether the playing field is still level. But at the same time, society evolves, expectations change, and institutions are being asked to adapt in ways they never had to before. And I think where many people land, whether they fully agree or not, is on this idea that clarity matters more than anything. Because athletes deserve to know the rules. They deserve to trust the system they're competing in, and they deserve a structure that protects the integrity of the category they've trained their entire lives to compete in. This isn't about shutting down a conversation. It's about having it honestly. Because the future of competition depends on how clearly we define fairness and how consistently we apply it. And that's something worth getting right. Remember to speak truth, stir thought.
Today's episode of Data and Dissonance is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller series, where global conflict, power, and high-stakes decisions aren't just headlines. They're the story. If you enjoy conversations like this about rules, systems, and the decisions that shape entire institutions, then you'll want to check out The Covenant Protocol and The Prophet Directive. These novels follow Caleb Rourke through a world of intelligence operations, geopolitical tension, and the consequences of leadership under pressure. And the story continues with Book 3, Black Echo Rising. It's also brought to you by the music behind the show. The album Uncaged, raw, grunge-inspired, built from real-life struggle, resilience, and the fight to push forward. And Four Wheelers and Hallelujah, a country album rooted in faith, family, and the values that keep people grounded when the world gets complicated. Songs like Stand Tall Charlie carry that same message: strength, character, and standing your ground when it matters most. You can find the books on Amazon, the music on Spotify, and all major streaming platforms, and everything connected to the show, merch, coffee, and more, through the website. Independent stories, independent music, independent thought. And that's what Data and Dissonance is all about.